Hello and welcome to the January edition of Coffee with the Pastors. My name is Pastor Daniel Hanson. I'm here today with Pastor Beverly Butler, Pastor Dan Gerrietts, and who's ever joining us online today. We are grateful for your presence and we invite you to grab your favorite beverage, preferably in this season, a warm one, if that's your MO. But grab your favorite beverage and join us in our conversation today. I was wondering about what we should talk about, and I had an epiphany. And I
Wow,
wondered maybe we could talk about Epiphany. Does that sound okay with you both today?
that sounds great.
All right. Well, whenever we get into confirmation, one of the first lessons we do is the church calendar, right? Because the church calendar is different than our regular secular calendar. We have a different, I think we talked a little bit in Advent about how that's the start of the church year. But we are flipping our church calendars on different days than we do with our January, February. Was it Greco-Roman? Is that the right term for the calendar? I didn't look that up, what we call the
Sure, that sounds
Sure,
good.
we'll call that for true for today. If it's wrong, you can put it in the comments and let us know what the right answer is. But as the church, we have a different calendar, right? We've been already in this new year since the end of November and into December in the season of Advent. We celebrated the 12 days of Christmas. It's not just a song; it's a church season. And now we on January 6th had Epiphany, Epiphany of our Lord, and now we have this season after Epiphany. So I feel like Epiphany is kind of the forgotten brother or sister of Christmas and Advent, right? We maybe kind of go all in on Christmas and Advent, and then we kind of scratch our head and say, well, what comes after that? There's a lot going on in Epiphany, and there's a lot of neat themes and robust texts that we explore. So I'm curious, as we are now we're now in the middle of January in the middle of the season of Epiphany. What does this season mean to you? Are there special texts that you enjoy from this season? When you think about reflecting on Epiphany, what's most meaningful to you?
Well, I have historically the arrival of the Magi was special, and as I grew up in Panama, the Day of the Kings was a particular. Oftentimes, gifts were exchanged on that day, so
Hmm.
that's what I was used to. But then, a number of years ago, when I lived in another time and place, I wasn't too far from and let's see, how would it be? It was American but Eastern Orthodox women, um, holy myrrh bearers, the women who brought the myrrh to the tomb. Anyway, I went there on a retreat. They were happy to have people come on retreat and participate in their worship, and it was it was Epiphany, so I was all ready for the celebration of the arrival of the Magi, and lo and behold, it was the baptism of Jesus.
Hmm.
No mention of the Magi; it was baptism of Jesus. So, what I learned that is the Epiphany, the manifestation with the baptism of Jesus, is the sense of God's presence in the Trinity. God, the voice from heaven, the dove came down, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus being baptized. So I was like, wow, okay. So there was a whole angle that I mean, we celebrated baptism of Jesus, but I don't even remember doing that as a kid, but in my adult years, but I didn't really connect those two with the celebration of Epiphany. It's just that, oh, that's when the baptism of Jesus day is. So, how about
Hmm.
the rest of you?
Yeah, I too. I have friends and people that I know that have grown up in other parts of the Christian family where Epiphany is a much bigger celebration than Christmas, much bigger deal. The visit of the Magi or celebrating the baptism of Jesus, which is always very strange to American Christians, where Christmas is such a culturally and from a church perspective is such a big holiday. But I think about Epiphany. I think about it's interesting. Those are the stories we've had so far in the season of Epiphany. We started with the story of the Magi, and we had the baptism of Jesus last weekend. This weekend, we begin the rest of the season of Epiphany, which I always think is really about revealing who Jesus is as Son of God, as Christ, born in human form or in human flesh. The story we get this weekend is the wedding in Cana and Jesus' first miracle in the Gospel of John, where he turns the water into wine. It's a clue, right? That Jesus is more than just a person. There's something else going on here, right? That's being revealed like a light shining in a dark room. All of a sudden, you see something that you didn't see before. And so, Epiphany, as it kind of unfolds through the weeks, I always think it's kind of about those kinds of stories of who is Jesus really, and who is he for us now? And so we get to kind of dive into that as the weeks move on, which is cool. And I think it's a beautiful thing in the Northern Hemisphere here where the days are dark and they are cold a lot of times, and it's a tough time of year for a lot of us. We get through the kind of the excitement of the holidays, and then there's just winter, in the bleak midwinter is where we are. And to think about um, Christ being revealed, seeing things in the midst of what's going to be hard to see sometimes, is a beautiful kind of season to celebrate.
Well, and so often we talk about a season as Epiphany, or as a season of light, right? As that revealing, and how powerful is that image when I think I looked up today, there will be 9 hours and 22 minutes of daylight today, right? That so for us in the Northern Hemisphere, that's really a helpful image that Christ our light shines in, and I sometimes think about Epiphany as a spotlight season, right? That we, as you both have said, this is a season where we are focusing on who Christ is, and I think that's cool after Christmas, like, and in a new year for a new start, that we refocus on some of these really familiar stories. Often, I don't know if it comes up this year, I haven't looked far enough ahead, but often we get the call to disciples, right? And so there's this wrestling of, well, what is our relationship to this Jesus as we see more clearly who he is? Um, but I've also fallen in love with the story of Epiphany Sunday, though, and it's a story that I don't think gets enough airtime. I mean, I think it kind of gets lumped in at Christmas time, like, oh yeah, the Magi bring their gifts. That's great. Like we share gifts at Christmas, which that's it's ni a nice message. Uh, but I am fascinated by King Herod, right? And like so we have the Magi coming, following the light of the star, but we have Jesus' own story being caught up in the story of the world, the story of the powers and principalities, the story of the tyrant king, right, who's coming for him. So that Jesus doesn't just, it's not just Silent Night, Holy Night into his adulthood, right? Jesus' own story already is in this chaotic, scary place, right? But God sees him through, right? And I'm sad that story doesn't come up as much because I think these other stories are also so important. But there was a sermon one time, I think it was Nadia Bolz-Weber, that was keep the Herod in Christmas or something like that. But it was just the emphasis was Jesus' own story, right? The story of God incarnate coming into the world, right? It reveals a lot about the world and the world's intentions, right? As much as it reveals about who God is, and that God is taking on, right, these big powers, right? And wow, like there's a lot there suddenly, right? As we think about who Jesus is, the world's reaction to Jesus, right? Already this is foreshadowing that. It's almost a little mini season of who Jesus will be before we get in, before we make it to Lent. I don't know. And I find that helpful, especially in a new year where maybe folks are wanting to focus in on their faith life a little more. Sometimes that's a goal for a new season. These texts provide the story world for that to happen.
Well, doesn't the season of Epiphany always end with transfiguration, right? The story of Jesus going up on the mountain, and there's these visions of past prophets and leaders, and the disciples are sort of seeing this and beginning to piece it together and go, oh, wait, this Jesus is connected, right, to what God has done in the past. And I always think that's such a beautiful, like, bright spotlight to shine at the very end of it all, right before we then go into Lent and really look at the end of the story, the passion narrative and those kinds of things. But yeah, that's a great image, the spotlight season. I like that.
Well, one of the images that we use frequently in the church is that Christ is our light, right? Oftentimes that's especially important in the Easter season, right? If there's an Easter vigil, the ancient refrain is the light of Christ, thanks be to God, right? And there's this bringing in of the light out of the darkness. There's I have often ended Good Friday services, the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness could not overcome it. And it's this beautiful verse from the prologue to John. Jesus himself will use the image, I am the light of the world. Um, how is this a helpful image for us as we think about Christ being our light in a season of Epiphany where we are looking for guidance from God on how to navigate life and our faith journey?
I think it's especially fitting, as you said, in the Northern Hemisphere here, because we are dealing with long nights still. And the darkness and the long nights affect some people more severely than others. So that it is a difficult time to get through. And for us, if we can focus on, where is the light, even when we're feeling like we're being dragged down into darkness, that we can remember that even though it seems to be all dark around us, that the truth is the light is there, even when we don't see it. And we can see the indication of God's beauty and assurance to us when it's dark. I remember I live in the country now, but I didn't until the last 13 years. So I was always in big city or small town, and there was plenty of light around, so I couldn't really see the stars. So I remember going out one night, looking up, and the sky was incredible. And I thought to myself, is this why we put lights on the Christmas tree and decorate our houses with light? Because we're trying to imitate this absolute glorious splendor up in the night sky. I don't know. Is that why we have lights on the Christmas tree? But it reminded me, I mean, if it had not been so dark, if I had been living in a community where there's so many street lights and etc., I would not have been able to see those stars. So a good reminder that even when we can't see the stars, they're there.
Hmm.
Even when we can't see the sun, we've had what was that a couple of weeks ago of fog and cloud. It was like the whole week, and even when we can't see the sun, we do know it's there. It is still there, and it will come back. Yeah. So Christ's light is with us always, and we are called then to be that light and to show that light in the world too.
Hmm.
Yeah, I always love that language from John's gospel that talks about Jesus' appearance as light shining in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. And I think, if you think about historically how that unfolded with the prophets, and then there was kind of a time of some centuries of really silence where there weren't great prophets speaking, and there really wasn't. It was almost like God had went silent for about 4 or 5 centuries, and then all of a sudden, Messiah is born in Jesus. We profess, and to think about Jesus' very appearance as kind of piercing this time of silence or of just disconnect or a sense of isolation and loneliness. It is a bit like a candle being brought into a dark room where suddenly it transforms things drastically. I think we've all had the experience of being in a very, very dark, difficult to see space and having light brought into it. And it's amazing how that really changes not just what you see, but the mood and the feel and everything. And so that's a powerful image that I always like at Christmas time and Epiphany time to think about light shining. And, even in our own sanctuary here at Trinity, when we take down the manger scene at the end of the Christmas season after the Sunday of Epiphany, we have for years now left up the lighted trees, the birch and the evergreen trees for the season of Epiphany. As just a reminder, right, that what we're really thinking about this season is the light that shines in the darkness and who he is and what that really means for us.
Hmm. I'm always grateful the Christmas lights stay a little longer. 'Cause
Yeah,
I
it's
think
just
it's such a stark contrast to go from this beautiful scene to everything's gone. My Christmas tree is still up, and I plan to keep it up for a little while at home as to bring some light to the dark evenings. Yeah, because there is something about that, right? I one of the things I enjoy about bringing confirmation students to Advent worship is just sitting in the space with the lights down and just seeing the lights of the both the Advent wreath right? Because do we take time, right, to notice those kinds of moments? I don't know if we always do, but yeah, similar to what Pastor Beverly was saying, I'm curious about how this metaphor has meant to different generations of Christians, specifically those like pre-industrial age, where electricity is readily available, because now access to light is instant, right? Like, I mean, how many of us carry phones in our pockets that can become a flashlight, or we flip the lights on and we just assume that they're going to come on? But for how many centuries of human existence has light been a huge gift to be able to have? And that would perhaps make night a more dangerous time, not knowing, are there wolves outside, right? Or depending on how far you go back, or not being able to see, so you don't know what's coming. What would it mean to have a watchman up on the walls with a light to look out, because who knows if the invading army is coming soon? Now we have big spotlights, right, or street lights or whatever. But yeah, that for centuries light isn't something that's always readily available, that we might take for granted. So to have those moments of light, that I think that's why candles feel so sacred in church, right? Because they've been for generations, right? That way that we have lit up this space and have been symbols of hope. So I'm always curious about how would great grandpa write about Jesus shining in the darkness as he sat next to his kerosene lamp, or who knows, whatever, what they were actually using. But I wonder if that would be different than we think about that today. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
I like the baptismal candle. I wonder if we could talk about that for a minute too, right? That this is an image that we hand out. So we talk about how Jesus' baptism is a part of Epiphany, and we celebrate that. But we always hand out a candle to to children or to adults as they are baptized. And what does that symbol mean, that we are handing a candle off in this moment? Because I I often teach that it's kind of like a birthday candle, but I don't think that's what it used to be.
I,
Uh, there's more to it.
yeah, I often think about it as the verses that and I can't recall if they're actually in the liturgy or if we just make it up and it's just what we do. But I think a lot of times here we recite a couple verses about that point where we're lighting the candle of the baptismal service, and one of them is where Jesus says, "I am the light of the world," which I think comes from the Gospel of John and maybe also in Matthew. But we say that, and then we repeat the "Let your light shine before others.
Hmm.
They may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." And that's also words from Jesus, right? And I always think about it as what we're literally doing is taking the light of Christ. If you think about the Paschal candle as a representation of the light of Christ, and you're literally multiplying it through this rite of baptism, right? Through this promise and this action of
Hmm.
water and the word, and you're handing the light to if it's a child, the ones who will raise that child understand what this means, that they are now light of the world. And if it's an adult, you're literally handing it to that person, saying, you are now this light.
Hmm.
And so go and be light,
Yeah.
be that in the world. And so it's kind of just like an acting out of what we're kind of confessing and what we believe happens.
Hmm. What a beautiful image to imagine. I mean, it's kind of like Christmas time when we light all the little candles and all the flames are out there, right? Like the place is aglow, right? Even though all the lights are off. That's
So
beautiful.
one of my favorite moments of the entire year is looking out at the candlelight service on Christmas Eve and seeing each person holding a light. It illuminates their face. If you
Hmm.
look out, you can see just the faces of all of the people in the room, and they can see the same in us, right? And I think that too is an image of how the light of Christ illuminates each of us, that it shines who we are in the world, and from that others can see God's glory
Hmm.
that goes through it. And yeah, and so you think about all the candles that have been handed out for baptism, it's a bit like that, just across like eons, right?
Yeah.
Of that light being shared and shined and taken out into the world.
Hmm.
It's also kind of exciting to hand people flame. And we're a little dangerous.
Yeah, a little. It adds a little intrigue to the experience.
Kind of like following Jesus, it's a little exciting, a little dangerous sometimes.
When the 4-year-old brother or sister reaches out their hand to grab the candle, that's the moment of true scariness. We're gonna hand that to mom or dad, or
Or having to remind them to go ahead and blow it out before you go try to sit down because you're going to try to go. Could be bad. You don't have to keep it lit the whole service. It's okay. Yeah.
Hmm.
Do you have any sense of families using the baptismal candle on the anniversary of the baptism? Or do people tell you about how they used it, or do you just never hear anything?
Yeah, some have told me, but I often talk about that with families when we do that because that was something that I was taught at some point and we've done with our children. And it's always kind of fun if we can remember on that day, we pull it out of the drawer, if we're having a family meal or something and we light it and we tell stories about their baptism day and who was there and what crazy, strange, funny things happened or what was significant. And so we do that. And I know some other families have done the same because they've said, we almost have that thing burnt down by the time the kids get to be teenagers. If you light it for an hour each year or however long, it starts to actually to go down, which I think that's a beautiful use of a baptismal candle. Way better than just letting it sit in a drawer and never changing, right? To actually use it to remember. That's awesome.
I think Marty tries to send out baptismal anniversary reminders at least some years, and so I don't know if that's every single year or if that's certain milestone years, but I think that's one way we try to remind folks that oh yeah, it's we might remember our birthday is this month, but our baptismal birthday might get lost in the shuffle. Here's a reminder of this special day and milestone, and well, shifting gears a little bit, shifting from baptismal imagery, there have been some who have pushed back a little bit on the image of Christ as light. And not because it's a bad image, but because sometimes we have associated then darkness as bad things, right? This is kind of if you read stories, right, the good guy is it's the knight in white shining armor, and the bad guy is the black knight wearing the black cloak, and that's how you can tell who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. And so some theologians have encouraged us to really think about our use of the word darkness, and wondered, if we keep talking about darkness as something that's bad or to be avoided, does that subconsciously then layer into some prejudice about people who have darker skin? And so I'm curious, what have you heard about, the church wrestling with this image of darkness always being bad? Are there examples in scripture where God does great things at night or in darkness that we can lift up as to kind of balance these images of Christ being our light and shining and being revealing, but also that God might do some holy work in dark places as well, and that's holy work.
What do you think, Beverly? You want to take this one first?
I just want to speak to an image that came to me right now as you said that is the seed. The seed
Mm.
has to be planted,
Mm.
buried basically, in darkness, before it will start to grow. It has to be buried in the soil. So I suppose there are ways to engineer growing with water, whatever. But anyway, the image of being buried. And it's so necessary. It is necessary for growth. And that's one of the other images with baptism, of course. Buried with Christ, dead to our sin, and then new life coming through the Holy Spirit. So, yeah, where I live, we have lots of night critters. They live because God made them that way. They come out when it's dark. They find their food when it's dark. When it starts to become daylight, it's time to go to bed. And we might not see them so much if they're not around when we're up, but they're there, and it's an important part of their being able to live. So God created the darkness as well as the light, and we need both. Think of folks, and I've never been to Alaska, but who lived in Alaska who have to make their house and their rooms somewhat dark in order to sleep well. At certain times of year, they have to be doing that all the time. So we need the dark. we may push against it and against that image and think that we don't want anything with darkness, but it's necessary for our growth, the quiet, um, the stillness, and not being distracted by what we would see if everything was bright.
Hmm.
Okay. Your comments about, how sometimes we carry kind of almost not conscious, not what's the word I'm looking for?
Subconscious. Yeah.
Subconscious kind of biases about around lightness and dark. It reminds me of a time I was teaching a class a number of years ago using a video resource. They had taken different stories of the Bible and illustrated them and put them into kind of this animated illustration. And the story was the creation story and then the temptation of Adam and Eve. And in their interpretation visually of the temptation story, they depicted the serpent in the garden, the tempter, was a snake that became a kind of a shadow person. And it was almost like they didn't have features. They were just dark scribbled in pencil. So it almost looked like, yeah, it was just a dark person without features. And at the time, there was somebody in this class who had spent years in ministry in a multiracial inner city neighborhood. And when they saw that depiction of the temper as a dark individual, it literally took their breath away. And I remember they said, "Oh no." Because for them, it was so clear, and I don't think it was the illustrator's intent, but they saw that as unintentionally identifying someone of darker skin as being like the tempter in the garden.
Mm.
And I never would have seen that. I never would have seen that, but this person did, and it just opened my eyes to just how easy that is for us to make those kinds of that, that lighter is good and darker is bad. And how quickly that can become kind of a racial commentary without us even meaning it to be. And so I think that sensitivity is really good, just to always be thinking about that and to be thinking, yeah, not only does God do some amazing things in shadows and in darkness, so many important conversations. Nicodemus comes to Jesus to discover the truth in the night,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the resurrection really starts in the darkness before the morning comes. We often see these pictures of the empty tomb with the sun shining, but most of the biblical accounts, the Easter happens in the dark. And you think
Yeah.
about the work that we believe Jesus does between Good Friday and between Easter morning, that is total in shadows, and yet that is where the real work of redemption and salvation and rescuing from the depths of death happens. And so, yeah, I think it's good to remember the nuances of that. Even the cross being a pretty metaphorically dark place, and yet it is the heart of our faith and where we believe God acts most powerfully. So, and to be careful that we don't make just dark images bad. Like it's Star Trek, right? They always used to joke with Star Trek, if you wanted to make one of the main characters the evil main character, you put a dark-haired goatee on them, right? And then you knew, like, it's so easy and it's so pervasive in particularly entertainment culture. It's good to critique that, I think.
And I think Scripture has provided us so many rich image to balance. So if Christ is the light of the world, is this rich image, it has given us all these other rich images to balance that with. There's a children's book called God's Holy Darkness that mentions many of the stories that you mentioned, but talks about God's holy and righteous work at night and in dark places. And it begins with the creation story, God calling the universe into being out of darkness. It extends into the story of Abraham looking out into the night sky when Abraham couldn't believe he would have a child, right? That God takes him out at night. Jacob wrestles with God at night, right? The cross and the resurrection. So many of these images that God is working salvation and good things in the middle of the night, in the middle of darkness, and the illustrations are awesome. So if you ever come across it, it's well worth a read. But yeah, I'm glad we could chat about that just because I think such a powerful image that we talk about light in this season of short days, but also that we can balance that and in the midst of those things. Well, maybe to close out our conversation today, we could these are short days. The night comes early, morning comes late. It's going to get a little better when the clock changes in March, but it's only January right now, so every day is a little bit better. But are there ways that you cope in this season? I know for some this is a really difficult season with maybe that seasonal affective disorder. Maybe it's the high of Christmas is done and it's really cold outside. Are there anything that helps you in the month of January, whether that's a spiritual practice or a wellness practice, to um, look ahead to brighter days, maybe warmer days?
I know about a practice, but I know that in December I was really looking forward to when the turn would happen on, was it the 22nd of December? It's the solstice, winter solstice, and okay, now, even though it will be a while before we can really see much evidence of it, the days are getting longer. So
You have chores to do at night
I
outside, right?
do.
How does the daylight affect that?
Well, it just makes it harder when I don't have the light. And so I strap a flashlight around myself and go on out to do what I need to do. Yeah. So makes it harder.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I think for me, finding ways to be active, I think there's something deeply probably biological about when the days get short that we just want to eat more carbs and sleep longer. It's that ancient kind of we need to store up calories to make it through the hard winter or something. And for me, sometimes just getting out for a long walk or finding a chance to work out or take some stairs that I didn't have to. All of those things seem to be helpful in just kind of dealing. But I think the other thing is just dressing well. To battle the cold by just putting on layers, and you get out the big blankets and you get out the slippers and you wear the heavy coat, and all of that just kind of feels good. I think this time of year when it's dark and cold.
Mm. I've been doing on the active comment. I've been doing yoga in January, and that's been great. Like just to move, to stretch, because I feel like whenever it's cold, like I'm tense all the time because it's cold, right? And so that's what your body does to be able to real stretch out and do some things with that. I also deeply embrace soup season. That is my resistance to January is all the soup of the week, right? Find some fun different soup recipes. They don't seem to taste good in the summertime when it's super hot, but in the wintertime, it's chili time. It's all soup season, and that's been a fun way to try to find some food that both nourishes but also feels nice and warm on cold days.
I'm struck by the contrast and therefore ever more grateful. So coming in on some of these days that we've just been having, coming indoors and feeling that warmth,
Mm,
meeting me, and then later on, it's not going to feel quite so warm in that space because it isn't really warm in my utility room, we call it, but it is warm when you come in from the outside. The contrast, so just makes me so grateful that I have heat.
mm,
I hear the furnace going on, and I'm grateful. The days that I don't have to jump up before the crack of dawn, like, oh, nice and warm, snuggled under my covers. So that contrast makes me even more aware and grateful. If it was just, totally nice all the time, would there be as much gratitude for what we have?
Hmm.
Um, I think not. At least not in my experience. I tend to take things for granted. So now that there's this contrast, it's like, oh, it's so nice to get inside. Um, yeah.
I always think this time of year too of like I don't know how to say the word right, but the Danish hygge, it's kind of become popular for a lot of Americans recently. But my understanding is it's a lot about finding coziness and comfort, not only in space and in temperature, but also with people. It's a season to sit and to be with people that bring warmth into your life. And I think that's a lovely idea. And it comes, if it comes from the Danes, it comes from some people who deal with some really long, dark winters, right? So they've perfected this perhaps. And I think there is great warmth in that if you have friends or loved ones, just things, even spaces that you like to be in that bring warmth. That's a good practice this time of year.
Hmm. Well, maybe if you have a favorite practice for surviving January and thriving, you can share that in the comments, and maybe that'll help somebody else out add to the conversation today. Well, any other things we want to say about Epiphany or this season in January? All right.
We covered it.
Well, very good. Well, we hope that your beverage is still warm and that it is still warming your bones. We will continue to journey together as a family of faith in this season of Epiphany. We hope to see you in worship or on the online streams, other things like that. But know our prayers go with you, and we look forward to connecting with you next time. God's blessings. Take care.